welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and today I want to talk about my reaction to the early Marvel reactions that I've seen online. Marvel Smash Up will be coming out soon. It's been available in other countries, and it's been interesting to see how people have been reacting to it, regardless of whether or not they've played it yet. Obviously, people will get a better opinion once they play it, but you never stop seeing people actually just speculating on how something will work based purely on card text alone, and the cards have been leaked because they were released in earlier countries. So Marvel Smash Up is really interesting. Personally, I am not a fan of Marvel Comics. I really don't understand what the big deal is, but there is a lot of appeal to other people, and that's why we have Marvel Smash Up, with this being a great opportunity to bring new people into the game by using the Marvel hype and just the idea that, wow, Marvel wants to be part of Smash Up. When I first learned that, I thought that was pretty cool that, a big company wanted to be involved. But then again, really don't care about Marvel myself. I know a lot of people have issues with the IP, but we're not really here to debate that because it's coming out. Let's talk about the actual cards. One of the things that is, first and foremost about the Marvel expansion is the fact that it functions like a new core. It's focused mostly on bringing new players into the game, and therefore the mechanics are going to be as self-strategizing as possible while still being new to the best extent possible. Some people have commented that, there's a lot of duplicate cards. And I should say, before I get too much into it, that the names of cards changed frequently, whether it's during playtesting or proofreading. So if I get a name wrong, I haven't memorized all the names yet. At some point that was the previous name. If I'm not confident about the name, I'll just refer to the minion slot. So you'll see a lot of duplicate abilities in the Marvel set. For example, the Ultimates 4 is pretty much a Cyclone, the Shield 2 is a Pinky, and there's numerous examples of this. Now, this isn't ideal, but at the same time, it kind of is. And it's weird because it took me a little bit of getting used to for that fact. Someone brought up the point that, when you're trying to bring new people into the game, what's your approach? Do you want to try and take a chance on something new that may not work or may not be intuitive? Or would you want to use something that's tried and true that works and is easy to explain? And that's the route that many of the Marvel cards took, with the context being new, the ability not being new. There are plenty of duplicate abilities in the game already, mostly from the action side. And it's not ideal, but you learn to live with it. I think this time on the minion side, you're seeing more of the duplicate abilities. But what's different is how they're used in the greater context to give a fresh experience. Now, for some people, particularly with the Kree, this has led people to think that factions are being replaced. There's been a lot of commentary that Kree basically are power creeping wizards. I disagree 100%. Yes, it is uncomfortably closer than I would have liked it to have been, but the wizards provide more draw power than the Kree do, and they also have the ability for extra minion plays, while also adding more direct draw, cards like Scry and Portal being stands out. Wizards take that draw power and instead replace it with actual power, and so they're more of a hybrid between the wizards and the mythic Greeks, and the Kree are a lot of fun that way. But I don't think that they replace wizards, especially not since wizards have a Titan, and Titans offer their own advantage, and they have the unmatched card draw of drawing a card every turn. To get some of the wizard cards, sometimes the Kree have them innately, like the Kree 3 is better than the Chrono Mage, or they can build their own, they have an action that can build their own Archmage. They don't get the Archmage natively. But I think when people play the Kree, they'll realize that the hand can lock up a little bit more than wizards can. They have a couple of terminal actions, as well as more situational actions, whereas the wizards, if you remember the cast system, were very flexible. So they do the same thing, but they approach it differently, and I think that difference matters. And regarding the idea of doing the same thing, but slightly different, that's actually a good thing, because what we're seeing with these abilities is the normalization of the ability. It's not really fair to compare someone to robots because robots can be insane. They're not balanced, in my opinion, for the general sense. So anything else that tries to do a swarm but doesn't do it as well as robots, we may think of that as being a bad thing, when in fact it's actually a good thing. As I'll talk about when I do my Shield preview in a couple of weeks, Shield was a paradox for me, because the cards don't seem that great, and yet they just work organically. And you get a strong faction out of what are objectively weaker cards. But it's kind of what a swarm faction is supposed to look like. And we see this a lot with Marvel. When we use an ability, or when we reference an old ability, what we had a chance to do was actually just normalize, what could have been problematic abilities. An example of this would be Miles Morales. It's a weaker Shinobi, but Shinobi is actually problematic. Now, I love that card, and I know that it's very powerful, but, after so many games, it kind of gets old that, I'm just going to not even bother on a base and jump on at the last second. And that can be really powerful, and it can be impossible for someone to counteract that, and in some ways, the game could be over, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's not something that you generally want to repeat. So even though Miles Morales is weaker, it does have the advantage of not being, game ruining in that sense. And it makes you wonder, what should Shinobi have been like all along? Miles Morales having two limitations: that it requires a minion to be on the base, and it loses a power, although Spider-Man can kind of replace that power, because Spider-Man would get +1 power for the special being played, for having a special ability, even though Miles loses 1 power when he's played as a special. So it's very important to remember that even if a card seems weaker, what are we trying to do with that ability? Now, this isn't always perfect. Like, a lot of people have talked about Nick Fury being a weaker Titania. I actually describe Nick Fury as being a stronger Pestling, because it has the same ability, but Pestling, if you remember from the Halflings, is power nerfed. He's a 3 instead of a 4, although I think he's better as a 3 because of the 3 synergies. But Nick Fury just has the same ability of someone who's ranked lower than that. So, and it's hard, because how do you not make Swarm broken if you give Nick Fury a better ability? And so that's really important when evaluating the Marvel faction, is what do the cards do overall? So in the case of the Ultimates, for example, they have a Cyclone. They have a Cyclone-like card. Now, you could take that in the Tornado context, and that's just, freely moving around. Maybe you're swarming at the last second. But it doesn't necessarily provide intra-faction synergy. But that's not the case with the Ultimates, because the Ultimate 3 gains a benefit when a minion moves, when a character moves, to or from its base. So if the 4 were to move off, that's +1 power. If it were to move back with one of their movement cards, it's another +1 power. So you can see that the ability is the same, but the payoff is actually different, because the context is what matters. Does that mean that the Ultimates, outpace the Tornadoes? No, because the Tornadoes still have that special. They have more opponent movement, whereas the Ultimates have a little bit of opponent movement, but they're focused mostly on moving themselves. And yeah, they have a couple of duplicate actions as well, but, mostly the context of coming together as a group. The Tornadoes don't really have that. They have movement, for the sake of movement, which is great, but I think the Tornadoes are more defined by their specials. And as long as someone doesn't have that trifecta of kicking someone off, moving yourself on, and then moving yourself off, Tornadoes will always be relevant. I'm kind of surprised that no one has talked a lot about Hydra, and the fact that Hydra has 12 minions. This is actually a big deal, and something that we really fought for, and we're happy to see that it got into the game. Because since Robots, we haven't had a faction that has had more than 10 minions in the game, and people have wanted it for a long time. So maybe people just haven't noticed. Maybe it becomes apparent once you've played with them. But it's really interesting, because when you have those 2 extra minions, it functions like pre-recursion. With a faction like Hydra, who wants to really, destroy themselves, you're going to want to have recursion, because otherwise you'll just run out of minions. Well, recursion can get scary because it means that, for other swarm combinations, it's just going to get stronger because you can recur anything, not just necessarily the Hydra minions. Well, if you give Hydra extra minions, you alleviate that problem. It still can get scary very quickly, but it fits perfectly into their strategy of having extra disposable units. Like, a unit is truly disposable when you have extra of them. And so they've got 6 Hydra agents. Ideally, it would have been great if they had, another minion in there who has slightly different ability. I remember campaigning for the Grim Reaper, but it may have been too much of a deep cut. Then again, I don't know anything about Marvel Comics. But just the fact that we had 12 minions was really good. There are a couple of important rules changes that I highly recommend you read in the rulebook. And make sure that you read it carefully, particularly about the specials rule. This could be a separate video, as well as another rule that was added that I'm not going to name at this time. I just think it's important that people read the rule book, and I want to make this clear that just because something is absent from the Marvel rulebook doesn't mean that that rule dominates the big crazy rulebook. The BCR is still the source of truth unless it's a net new rule. For example, the definition of effect is actually different in Marvel, but the definition of effect doesn't necessarily supersede what was in the other rulebook. It's just a matter of the fact that they didn't want to add a definition that may not necessarily apply to the cards in the Marvel set. Personally, I disagree with that approach. I think that's going to create more confusion. That's why I'm letting people know that, specifically rules around card resolution and the specials rule, those are the net new rules that you should be looking at for the Marvel rulebook. Because the special rules has great impact on some other factions that were released and play tested between, I think it was Cease and Desist, when they had the modern special rule, and now, we're in the Stage 3 rule. Overall, it's been good to see that people are pleasantly surprised by Marvel. I think that, once people start to see the greater picture, it really changes how you approach it. The way that I've described it to people is that Marvel is greater than the sum of its parts. When you look at some of the abilities, they don't really stand out as much. There aren't as many standout cards, and that's specifically because of the fact that you're trying to bring in new people. But what you get is a standout experience when you take a bunch of seemingly ordinary cards, but they just combine really well to be really solid. And I think that's the best way to describe Marvel. There's a lot of really good combos that are being introduced into the game, and I highly recommend that you try it out and form your own opinion. And I look forward to seeing the full reactions once people have actually had a chance to play it. So that's my reaction to the Marvel reactions. Hopefully we'll be able to start the Marvel previews soon. I'm hoping for next week, but it's not necessarily a guarantee. It will probably be different. Because there are less standout cards, it doesn't really make sense to do, the leader video and the action video. So probably just combine it into a singular faction one. But still, really good content that I'm looking forward to sharing. That's pretty much it for today. Thanks so much for watching. Let's shut it down.